The great chamber of the Galactic Council stretched upward like a cathedral made of starlight and ancient stone. 12 platforms rose in a perfect circle, each one holding the representative of a species that had ruled the stars for thousands of years before humanity ever looked up at the night sky and wondered what lay beyond. The air hummed with translation fields and the soft whisper of 100 different breathing patterns, and in the center of it all stood Ambassador Caroline, her hands folded calmly behind her back as she listened to the verdict that would change everything. High Arbiter of the Dominion rose from his platform, his scaled features twisted into something that might have been satisfaction or contempt. They were ancient beings, their civilization stretching back nearly 1 million years, and they had never quite forgiven the universe for allowing such young upstarts as humanity to join their precious council. His voice echoed through the chamber like thunder rolling across distant mountains. "The council has reached its decision," he announced. "Humanity will accept the following restrictions effective immediately. All human trade vessels will be limited to designated corridors. Human scientists will no longer participate in joint research initiatives. Human diplomatic standing will be reduced to observer status. These measures are necessary to preserve the stability of galactic civilization." Caroline felt the eyes of every delegate upon her. They watched with something like pity in their compound eyes. They shifted nervously on their platform, their feathered crests flattening with discomfort. Even the, usually so stoic and unreadable, seemed to lean forward with anticipation. Everyone expected the human ambassador to explode with anger or threaten retaliation, or at the very least demand an explanation for this sudden and devastating judgment. She did none of these things. "Thank you, High Arbiter," Caroline said, her voice steady and warm. "I appreciate the Council taking the time to reach this decision. May I request a 30-day transition period to allow for the orderly withdrawal of human personnel and resources from Council space?" Blinked, his vertical pupils dilating with confusion. He had prepared responses for threats and arguments and desperate pleas. He had not prepared for polite acceptance. The silence in the chamber stretched uncomfortably long before he finally nodded. "30 days is acceptable," he said slowly. "The council session is concluded." Caroline bowed respectfully to each platform in turn, spending exactly the same amount of time acknowledging each species regardless of their vote. Then she turned and walked out of the chamber with the same measured pace she had used to enter it, her footsteps echoing softly against the polished floor. Only when the great doors closed behind her did she allow herself a small, sad smile. She found a quiet alcove overlooking the station's observation deck and activated her personal communicator. The face that appeared on the holographic display belonged to Director Cole, head of Earth's United Diplomatic Corps. He was a tired-looking man in his 60s with gray hair and kind eyes that had seen too many negotiations fail and too many friendships break apart over politics. "They did it," Caroline said simply. "Full restrictions effective in 30 days." Nodded slowly. He did not seem surprised. "We expected this after they started pushing their agenda last year. How did the other species vote?" 7 in favor, 5 against. The N voted against, along with the and the, but they have too much influence over the smaller delegations. "And how did you respond?" Caroline allowed herself a genuine smile. "I thanked them for their time and asked for a transition period." Laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. "I imagine that was not the reaction they expected." "No," Caroline agreed. "Looked like I had spoken to him in a language his translator could not process." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, two humans separated by vast distances of space, but united by decades of friendship and shared purpose. Finally spoke again, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that had been made long before this day. "It is time for the quiet protocol," he said. Caroline closed her eyes. She had hoped it would never come to this, but she had also known in her heart that it was inevitable. The galaxy had grown too dependent on humanity while simultaneously resenting that dependence. Something had to give. "I will begin coordinating with our people across Council space," she said. "No threats, no sabotage, no angry speeches. We simply leave." Nodded, every human engineer, scientist, doctor, trader, and diplomat. Everyone comes home. We do it quietly and professionally, and we make sure to thank everyone we worked with along the way. "They will not understand at first," Caroline said softly. "They think we are weak because we do not threaten them. They think we are foolish because we do not fight." "Let them think what they want," replied. "In 30 days, they will understand exactly what humanity has been contributing to this galaxy for the past 50 years. And they will understand it not because we told them, but because they will feel the absence of it in every corner of their lives." Caroline ended the call and stood for a long moment at the observation window. Below her, the great station bustled with activity. Ships from 100 different worlds docked and departed. Beings of every shape and size went about their business, most of them unaware that the galaxy they knew was about to change forever. She thought about the human engineers who kept the communication networks running. She thought about the human doctors who staffed medical stations on the frontier. She thought about the human negotiators who spent their lives mediating disputes between species that had been fighting for. All of them would be coming home now. All of them would pack their belongings, say goodbye to friends and colleagues they might never see again, and leave behind the work they had dedicated their lives to. It was not fair, it was not right, but it was necessary. Caroline had spent her entire career believing that diplomacy meant finding common ground and building bridges between different peoples. She still believed that, but she had also learned a harder lesson over the years, one that humanity had learned again and again throughout its long and troubled history. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply walk away. She straightened her uniform, composed her features into the calm and professional expression that had served her so well over the years, and began walking toward her office. There were messages to send and arrangements to make and 1,000 small details to attend to. The galaxy wanted humanity gone. Very well, humanity would go. And the galaxy would learn, in the quiet emptiness that followed, exactly what it had lost. The first week passed quietly, almost peacefully, and the Galactic Council congratulated itself on having finally put humanity in its proper place. High Arbiter gave interviews to news networks across a dozen systems, explaining how the restrictions would restore balance to galactic civilization and prevent any single young species from gaining too much influence. The delegation celebrated with traditional ceremonies that lasted 3 days, and their allies among the council sent messages of support and admiration. Nobody noticed the small things at first. Nobody noticed when the communication relay at Station Theta 7 went offline for 6 hours because the human technician who maintained it had packed her bags and left on a transport bound for Earth. Nobody noticed when the shipping schedules along the outer rim began running slightly behind because human logistics coordinators were no longer there to optimize the routes. Nobody noticed when a minor trade dispute between the and the escalated into a shouting match, because the human mediator who usually handled such matters had already departed. But the Science Consortium was the most prestigious research institution in the galaxy, a gleaming complex of laboratories and libraries that floated in orbit around a dying star. Scientists from every council species competed for the honor of working there, and the breakthroughs that emerged from its halls had shaped galactic civilization for 10,000 years. And now, slowly but steadily, its operations were grinding to a halt. Director stood in the central operations room, watching status indicators turn from green to yellow to red across his display screens. His compound eyes tracked a dozen different problems simultaneously, and none of them had good solutions. The faster-than-light communication network, he muttered to his assistant. How dependent are we on human maintenance teams? His assistant, a young researcher named, pulled up the relevant data and went very still. 62% director. Human specialists designed the core routing algorithms and have been maintaining them for the past 30 years. Closed his eyes. And how many of those specialists remain? Checked again. As of this morning, none. The last 3 departed on yesterday's transport. Across council space, similar scenes played out in 100 different locations. They discovered that their planetary defense grid relied on calibration software written by human engineers who had never thought to train anyone else in its maintenance. They realized that the agricultural stations feeding their outer colonies used growing techniques developed by human botanists who had shared their knowledge freely, but were now taking their expertise home. They found themselves unable to complete construction on their new space station because the architectural plans had been drafted by a human firm that was no longer accepting contracts from council species. Ambassador Caroline attended a trade summit on the 4th day, walking into a room full of delegates who expected her to be broken and bitter. Instead, she smiled warmly, greeted old friends by name, and took her seat as if nothing unusual had happened. High Arbiter could not resist the opportunity to gloat. "Ambassador," he called across the chamber, "I trust you are finding the transition to observer status comfortable. Perhaps humanity will learn some humility during this period of reflection." Caroline rose to her feet, and the room fell silent. Every delegate remembered her calm acceptance of the council's verdict, and they wondered what she would say now. "High Arbiter," she began, her voice carrying easily through the chamber, "I want to take this opportunity to thank every species represented here for the partnerships we have shared over the past 50 years. These relationships have meant more to humanity than I can express." She turned to the delegation. "To the people, thank you for allowing our medical researchers to work alongside your finest physicians. The treatments we developed together have saved millions of lives across the galaxy." She turned to the colonies. "Thank you for welcoming our agricultural teams during the Great Famine. It was an honor to help restore your food production and ensure that no child went hungry." She turned to themselves and shifted uncomfortably on his platform. "To the Dominion, thank you for accepting our assistance during the asteroid field collapse 12 years ago. Our rescue teams were proud to work alongside your mining crews and bring your people home safely." The chamber had grown very quiet. Caroline continued around the room, naming specific contributions humanity had made to each species, specific lives saved and problems solved and crises averted. She spoke for nearly 20 minutes, and by the end of it, several delegates were staring at their displays with troubled expressions. Finally, she came to her main announcement. In accordance with the Council's decision, all human-operated humanitarian stations along the frontier rim will be closing within the next 2 weeks. We want to ensure an orderly transition and give local authorities time to establish replacement services. The ambassador delegate rose sharply from her platform. Her feathered crest was fully extended in alarm. "Ambassador, those stations serve 17 colony worlds. They are the only medical facilities available to millions of our people." Caroline nodded sadly. "I understand, delegate, and I am truly sorry, but the Council has made its position clear. Humanity is to withdraw from galactic affairs, and we must respect that decision." She sat down and the trade summit continued, but nobody could focus on the agenda. The delegation huddled together in urgent conversation. The representative was already sending messages back to his. Even the, usually so composed and logical, seemed shaken. High Arbiter tried to restore order, but his voice had lost its confident thunder. The meeting ended early, and delegates scattered to deal with crises they had not anticipated. Caroline walked back to the human embassy alone, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. She passed a maintenance worker who was struggling with a broken power conduit, and she stopped to help him without thinking about it. Together, they traced the fault to a loose connection and repaired it in minutes. "Thank you," the worker said, his compound eyes bright with gratitude. "I have been trying to fix this for hours." Caroline smiled. "It is what we do," she said simply. She continued on her way, leaving the worker staring after her with a puzzled expression. He had heard the news about humanity's restrictions, like everyone else. He had assumed, like everyone else, that the humans would be angry or resentful. Instead, one of their highest diplomats had stopped to help him fix a broken power conduit. He thought about that for a long time after she left. By the second week, the galaxy began to understand what it was losing. The Universal Translation Matrix was the backbone of galactic civilization. It allowed species with completely different vocal structures to communicate instantly and perfectly, turning 1,000 incompatible languages into one seamless conversation. The system had existed for centuries before humanity arrived, but it had grown enormously complex as new species joined the Council, and somewhere along the way, human linguists had become essential to its maintenance. Nobody had planned it that way. Human researchers had simply been fascinated by the challenge of translation across species barriers, and they had volunteered for the tedious work of updating algorithms and correcting errors, and adding new vocabulary as languages evolved. They had done this work quietly and without complaint for decades, never asking for recognition or reward. Now they were gone, and the translation matrix was beginning to fail. Minor incidents across Council space. A merchant accused a trader of cheating him, when in fact the translation had simply rendered a standard greeting as a grave insult. A diplomatic message to the government was translated with 17 critical errors, nearly triggering a border dispute. A child lost in a busy spaceport could not make herself understood to the security officers trying to help her. The Galactic Stock Exchange, which processed trillions of transactions every day, experienced its worst crash in 3 centuries. Human traders had written the stabilizing algorithms that prevented wild price swings, and without those safeguards, panic selling cascaded through the markets like wildfire. Fortunes were lost in hours. Entire planetary economies teetered on the edge of collapse. On a joint military outpost at the edge of Council space, Lieutenant Commander Grace received her recall orders and felt her heart break. She had served on this station for 15 years, working alongside officers from a dozen different species. She had trained with them and fought beside them, and celebrated their victories and mourned their losses. She had learned their customs and attended their ceremonies and become, in every way that mattered, part of their family. Now she was being ordered to leave. Commander found her in the observation lounge, staring out at the stars with tears streaming down her face. The officer had been her closest friend since her first day on the station, and seeing her like this caused him physical pain. "Grace," he said softly, sitting down beside her, "is there nothing that can be done?" She shook her head. "The orders came directly from Earth. All military personnel are being recalled. I have to leave on tomorrow's transport." Was quiet for a long moment. In 15 years, he had never seen Grace cry. He had seen her face down pirates and negotiate with hostile species and lead rescue missions into impossible situations, always with the same steady courage. But this was different. This was not a battle she could fight. "I spoke with my superiors," he said finally. "I asked if you could be given special status as a consultant or an observer, something that would let you stay." Grace managed a small smile through her tears. "Thank you, old friend. But it would not work. The Council made their feelings about humanity very clear. If I stayed, I would only cause problems for you." She reached into her bag and pulled out a wooden box, which she pressed into his hands. He opened it and found a chest set inside, the pieces carved from dark and light wood, each one polished to a warm glow. "I made this for you," Grace said. "I have been working on it for the past 3 years, carving a piece whenever I had spare time. I wanted to give it to you on the 20th anniversary of our friendship, but I suppose now will have to do. Held the chest set like it was made of precious crystal. He remembered the countless hours they had spent playing this strange human game, the conversations they had shared over the board, the way Grace had patiently taught him to think several moves ahead. These memories were among the most precious he possessed. "I will keep it always," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "and I will teach others to play so that something of our friendship lives on." They embraced then, two officers from different worlds who had become as close as siblings, knowing that they might never see each other again. Far away on the High Arbiter sat in his private chambers and tried to ignore the growing stack of reports on his desk. Each one brought worse news than the last. The water purification systems that served 40% of Council worlds were beginning to malfunction, their human designers no longer available to provide maintenance support. The territorial disputes that human negotiators had kept under control for decades were flaring up again, threatening to escalate into open conflict. The disaster relief infrastructure that had saved countless lives was crumbling, as human emergency response teams departed one by one. His advisors had warned him. They had told him that humanity's contributions to galactic civilization were more extensive than anyone realized, but had dismissed their concerns, confident that the Council species had survived for before humanity arrived and would continue to thrive without them. Now he was beginning to wonder if he had made a terrible mistake. One of his senior advisors, a young named, entered the chamber with yet another report. This one concerned the frontier rim, where human humanitarian stations were closing as promised. Without those stations, 17 colonies would have no access to medical care. 3 mining outposts would lose their emergency evacuation capabilities. 2 research facilities would be unable to receive supplies. High Arbiter said carefully, "Perhaps we should reconsider our position. The humans have not threatened us or retaliated against us. They are simply leaving, exactly as we asked them to. But the consequences of their departure are becoming severe." Slammed his fist against the desk. "The Council has spoken," he growled. "We will not show weakness by revering our decision. The galaxy survived without humans before, and it will survive without them again." But even as he spoke the words, he could hear how hollow they sounded. The reports kept coming, each one documenting another system failing, another crisis brewing, another reminder that humanity had woven itself into the fabric of galactic civilization more thoroughly than anyone had imagined. And the worst part was that the humans were not even fighting back. They were not sabotaging systems or demanding concessions or making threats. They were simply saying goodbye to their friends, packing their belongings and going home. Somehow that made it worse. Stared at the reports on his desk and wondered, for the first time, what he had truly done. The third week brought disaster. They orbited a star that had always been slightly unstable, prone to occasional flares that their ancestors had learned to predict and prepare for. Over the centuries, they had built a planetary shield network to protect their cities from the worst of the radiation, and that network had served them well for thousands of years. But the network had been upgraded 30 years ago with human help. Human engineers had designed the new calibration systems. Human programmers had written the software that coordinated the shield generators, and human technicians had maintained the delicate balance that kept everything running smoothly. Now those humans were gone, recalled to Earth along with everyone else, and when the largest solar flare in recorded history erupted from the sun, the shields failed. Alarms screamed across 3 continents. Emergency broadcasts warned citizens to seek shelter underground, but there was not enough time. The flare was moving faster than anyone had predicted, a wall of deadly radiation that would sweep across the planet in less than 6 hours. Grand Minister of the government stood in his command center, watching the projections with growing horror. 3 major cities lay directly in the path of the flare. 20 million people would be exposed. The death toll would be catastrophic. Contact the humans, he ordered. Contact anyone who knows how to repair the shield network. His communications officer worked frantically at her console, but the answer came back the same every time. The human engineers had departed. The human technicians had gone home. The human experts who had built this system and maintained it for 3 decades were scattered across a dozen transports heading back to Earth. But one of those transports was closer than the others. Captain Samuel Price of the cargo ship Endeavour was halfway between space and the Sol system when the distress call came through. He was a practical man in his 50s, weathered by decades of hauling freight through the void, and he had seen enough of the galaxy to know that emergencies did not care about politics. He also had 3 human engineers on his crew, who had spent the last 10 years working on shield systems. How long to reach he asked his navigator. At maximum speed, 4 hours. But Captain, we have orders to return directly to Earth. We are not supposed to stop for anything. Samuel looked at the distress call on his screen. He looked at the projected casualty figures. He looked at the timestamp showing how little time remained before the flare hit. Change course, he said quietly. Maximum speed to prime. The navigator hesitated for only a moment before obeying. Some orders were meant to be broken. They arrived with less than 2 hours to spare. Samuel's engineers, led by a young woman named, dove into the shield network's control systems while technicians watched in astonishment. Had helped design these systems when she was fresh out of school, and she knew every circuit and every line of code. The problem turned out to be a cascade failure in the calibration matrix, exactly the kind of issue that required human expertise to diagnose and repair. Worked for 16 hours straight, her fingers flying over control panels, her voice hoarse from shouting instructions to her team. Engineers worked alongside her, learning as they went, taking notes on everything she did. The shields came online with 43 minutes to spare. When the flare hit, it broke against the shield network like a wave against a cliff. The cities below were bathed in soft blue light as the shields absorbed and redirected the deadly radiation, channeling it harmlessly into space. 20 million people lived because a cargo captain had ignored his orders, and a young engineer had remembered the system she helped build. Grand Minister found Captain Price on the landing pad as the Endeavour prepared to depart. The leader was a tall being with gray skin and deep-set eyes, and those eyes were bright with tears. "You saved us," said simply. "After everything our council did to your people, you came back and saved us." Samuel shrugged uncomfortably. He had never been good at receiving gratitude. "It is what we do," he said. "It is what humans have always done." Before the Endeavour could leave space, word of what had happened spread across the galaxy. They were next. A plague had broken out on one of their frontier colonies, a fast-moving illness that their doctors had never seen before. They sent desperate requests to the Council for help, but the Council's medical resources were stretched thin, and nobody could respond in time. Nobody except the human medical frigate Hope, commanded by Dr. Shaw. Was a small woman with silver hair and steady hands, and she had spent her entire career serving on the frontier, treating patients who had nowhere else to turn. She had received her recall orders 2 weeks ago, but she had delayed her departure to finish treating a difficult case. Now, she was the only hope for a colony of 300,000 people. She did not hesitate. Her team worked around the clock, analyzing the pathogen and developing a treatment protocol. Trained local medical staff shared her findings freely and refused to leave until every patient was recovering. When officials tried to pay her, she waved them away with a tired smile. "We became doctors to help people," she said. "That does not change just because politics gets in the way." One by one, stories like these spread across council space. a human rescue team that diverted to save miners trapped in a collapsed tunnel, a human teacher who stayed behind to finish the school year on a colony, a human mechanic who spent his last day repairing the life support systems on a struggling space station, refusing to leave until the job was done. None of them were ordered to help. None of them were paid or rewarded or even thanked by their own government. They simply saw people in need and responded the only way they knew how. The Grand Minister held a press conference and publicly denounced the Council's decision. The delegate delivered an impassioned speech to her parliament, calling for an immediate reversal of the restrictions on humanity. The Science Consortium released a report documenting every human contribution to galactic civilization over the past 50 years. The evidence was overwhelming. Humanity had not joined the galactic community to conquer or exploit. They had joined to help, to contribute, to make things better for everyone. They had asked for nothing in return except friendship and fair treatment, and when that treatment was, they had simply walked away. And even as they walked away, they could not stop themselves from helping. High Arbiter watched the news feeds from his private chambers, his face gray with shock. For the first time in his long career, he understood that he had been completely and utterly wrong. The galaxy did not need to fear humanity. The galaxy needed to thank them. And he had no idea how to fix what he had broken. On the 28th day, the great chamber of the Galactic Council was filled with chaos. Ambassador Caroline had arrived expecting to finalize humanity's withdrawal, to sign the last papers and shake the last hands and close the door on 50 years of partnership. Instead, she found the 12 platforms in complete disarray, delegates shouting at each other across the chamber, translation systems struggling to keep up with the flood of angry voices. 6 species had formally protested the restrictions on humanity. And even the, who rarely involved themselves in political disputes, had all submitted motions demanding an immediate reversal of the Council's decision. Their representatives stood on their platforms with arms crossed and expressions grim, refusing to participate in any other business until the matter was resolved. The delegation looked smaller than Caroline remembered. Several seats were empty, and the remaining officials huddled together like survivors of a shipwreck. Their economy was in, their shipping lanes disrupted, their carefully cultivated political alliances crumbling around them. The species they had pressured into supporting the restrictions were now turning against them, furious at being drawn into a decision that had caused so much damage. And High Arbiter was nowhere to be seen. In his place stood a different figure, one that Caroline recognized with surprise. Matriarch of the was ancient even by the standards of her long-lived species. Her feathers faded to soft silver, her eyes deep with wisdom accumulated over centuries. She had never held a council position before, preferring to advise from the shadows, but now she stood at the central podium with quiet authority. "Ambassador," she said, and her voice carried easily through the chaos, silencing the chamber. "Please approach." Caroline walked forward, her footsteps echoing in the sudden stillness. She stopped at the traditional position for addressing the council and waited, her hands folded calmly before her. Matriarch studied her for a long moment. "Where is High Arbiter?" Caroline asked. "He has resigned," replied. His position became untenable when the full extent of his miscalculation became clear. "I have been appointed to serve in his place until new elections can be held." Caroline nodded slowly. She felt no satisfaction at its fall. She had never wanted any of this. All she had ever wanted was for humanity to be treated fairly, to be judged by their actions rather than their youth. Ambassador continued, "On behalf of the Galactic Council, I wish to offer a formal apology to humanity for the restrictions that were imposed upon your people. We were wrong. We allowed fear and resentment to cloud our judgment, and we made a decision that has caused immense harm to countless worlds, including our own." She paused, and Caroline saw something remarkable in her ancient eyes. Not just political calculation, but genuine shame. Your people did not fight back, said softly. You did not threaten or retaliate. You simply left, and even as you left, you continued to help anyone who needed you. They owe you 20 million lives. They owe you an entire colony. Every species in this chamber owes you debts that we can never fully repay. Caroline remained silent, waiting. We ask, said, that humanity reconsider its withdrawal. We ask that you remain part of the galactic community, and we offer, as a gesture of our sincerity, an elevated position on the Council. Full voting rights on all matters, a permanent seat at the highest levels of galactic governance. This is the least we can do to acknowledge what you have given us. The chamber was utterly silent. Every delegate watched the human ambassador, waiting for her response. This was what many of them had expected from the beginning, what they had feared. Humanity would use this crisis to seize power, to claim the authority they had always secretly wanted. Caroline took a deep breath. Matriarch, she said slowly, I accept your apology on behalf of humanity. We harbor no resentment toward the Council or toward any species represented here. We understand that fear of the unknown is natural, and we do not blame you for being cautious about a species as young and strange as we must seem to you. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was warm but firm. However, I must respectfully decline the offer of an elevated position. A murmur rippled through the chamber, blinked in surprise. Ambassador, surely you understand what we are offering. This would give humanity power and influence that no young species has ever possessed. I understand perfectly, Caroline replied, and that is precisely why I must decline. Humanity did not join the galactic community to seek power. We joined because we wanted to help. We wanted to learn from older civilizations and share what we have discovered. We wanted to be good neighbors. She looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of delegates from a dozen different species. If we accept an elevated position now, she continued, it will seem as though everything we did was calculated to achieve exactly this result. It will seem as though our kindness was just another form of manipulation. That is not who we are, and that is not the message we want to send. Then what do you want? Asked quietly. Caroline smiled, and it was the same warm smile she had worn on the day the restrictions were announced, the smile that had confused and unsettled the entire council. We want to be your friends, she said simply. We want to work alongside you as equals, not above you or below you. We want to help when help is needed and learn when learning is possible and grow together toward a future that is better for everyone. She spread her hands. That is all we have ever wanted. That is all we will ever want. The silence stretched for a long moment. Then Matriarch did something that no high arbiter had ever done in the history of the council. She bowed. Humanity is welcome here, she said, as friends, as equals, as partners. One by one, the other delegates rose and bowed as well. The who had been saved by a cargo captain who ignored his orders. The whose colony had been saved by a doctor who refused to leave. The whose scientists had learned so much from human colleagues over the decades. Even the humbled and diminished but beginning to understand what they had almost lost. Caroline bowed in return, honoring each species as she had on the day this all began. But this time, when she straightened, she was smiling not with sadness but with hope. That evening, she returned to her quarters and found a message waiting for her. It was from Commander of the military, and attached to it was a photograph. The photograph showed a wooden chess set, its pieces carved from dark and light wood, displayed in a place of honor in a glass case. A small plaque beneath it read, in the language, gift from Lieutenant Commander Grace, human friend. The message itself was brief. Some bonds cannot be broken by politics, had written. I am teaching my students to play chess. They are terrible at it, but they are learning. I hope that one day Grace will return and see how far they have come. Caroline read the message 3 times, and each time she smiled a little wider. humanity would remain in the galaxy, not as conquerors or rulers, not as masters or servants, but as what they had always been. Neighbors, friends, people who helped because helping was the right thing to do. The stars outside her window burned bright and cold, scattered across the infinite darkness like seeds waiting to grow. Somewhere out there, human engineers were returning to their posts. Human doctors were reopening their clinics. Human teachers and researchers and diplomats were unpacking their bags and getting back to work. The galaxy had trembled when humanity, now it would learn to stand together with them. And that, Caroline thought, was exactly as it should be.